Hello, today we're going to do an unboxing and review of the Neutrik NYS-SPP-L1 Patch Bay. Let's first start open here. Okay. We have our usual packaging. Comes from Sweetwater, so that's their stuff, and the candies that Sweetwater always gives. And here is the Patch Bay. A box within a box, pretty much what we expect these days. I'm curious to see how it compares to the older models. Okay. This is clearly much more solidly built than the older one. Looks very good. So here's our Patch Bay. It's a 48 socket Patch Bay, TRS. We have our screws for mounting on the rack. We have an instruction manual. And we have these things. Well, we'll look further into it. Yeah, we have some adhesive strips to put on that lets you write on it. I'm probably not going to use these. I use a labeling machine. And that seems to be it. Okay, let's look into this, and then we'll see further how this stacks up. The top of the unit shows the various ways that this patch bay can be configured. On the far left side, we show the various grounding topologies that this patch bay will support. The sack of little metal clips turns out to be jumpers. These allow us to implement the various grounding configurations. The default configuration is just fine for me, so therefore I'm not going to be doing anything with these clips. The next two show the default method of normalization. We see that if the front has no plugs in it, we see that the two back sides are normalized together. But as soon as we put a plug into the lower portion of the front, this normalization is broken, and then both the front and the back pass through to each other. There is an alternative way that this can be normalized. In this case, the two front will be normalized with no plugs in it, but as soon as we put something into one of the particular back jacks, then it will again pass through for both sides. We're going to look at this a little more closely. For this, let's turn over our patch bay and let's insert a couple of cables into the back. The normalization is easily demonstrated with a continuity tester. This continuity tester will give a signal whenever there is a direct electrical connection. If we connect two cables to the rear of our patch bay, we see that if there's nothing connected to the front, there is a direct connection between the top and bottom jacks of the rear of our patch bay. Everyone will have their own system. According to my system, I have the outputs and inputs of my effects channeled through the patch bay. The various effects are demarked by white lines that I have put on, and I have the inputs on top and I have the outputs on the bottom. It's also good for us to look at balanced versus unbalanced connections. For a connection to be balanced, every aspect of it has to be balanced. That means the patch bay, the cables, the inputs and outputs of our various connected devices. If any one of them is unbalanced, well, then the entire connection is unbalanced. To help things with me, I have put little dots on. I have a yellow dot to indicate that it is a balanced connection, and I have a red dot to indicate that it is at some level unbalanced. Fortunately, we do not have to do anything with the patch bay to make it different between a balanced and unbalanced connection. This will be handled automatically. But let us get back to the topic of normalization and see if the default normalization of our patch bay is actually going to work for us. Unfortunately, with the default normalization of this patch bay, this is going to be very, very difficult. And here's the reason why. If I'm not using any particular effect and I have the effects powered up, then we see that with this default normalization, I have my outputs connected directly to my input. Well, that's not something we want to do because very bad things can happen. It's more convenient for me that if I have the inputs and outputs not at all connected to each other. And for this, I need to look at one of the alternative forms of normalization, which is shown on the top of the case. Unfortunately, to actually implement this, I have to take the patch bay apart. I have to reverse the various modules and put it back together. That's what we're going to look at right now. Let us start by looking at the 3 screws that are on each side. We're going to take the middle one off, so we have to unscrew the middle screw. And then we have to unscrew the middle screw on the other side as well. Once both screws are removed, then we can remove the front plate. Once the front plate is removed, then we have access to all the modules. Now, whichever modules you want, you take them and you reverse them. Now, I'm removing all of the modules and reversing them, but you may find that some are quite acceptable to you in their default state. It's a very flexible system, and you can choose to mix and match whichever normalization scheme works for you. After you have reversed all the modules that you're planning to, then you have to put the front plate back on. But remember, each module has to be correctly seated, so you may have to do some manipulation of the various modules to make sure that everyone is seated correctly, everyone has its rims protruding from both the front and the rear holes. When you are absolutely certain that the modules are seated, then you can reattach the front plate by attaching the screws. It is very important that your patch bay be marked. If you know how it's going to be configured, you can do it at this time. Otherwise, you can mark it after you've already installed it into your rack. It's now time for us to mount it into our rack. First of all, we have to remove the 4 retaining screws which are holding the spacers onto each end of the rack. Once these temporary retaining screws are removed, we must remember not to lose these 2 spacers. At this point, we simply mount our patch bay and the 2 spacers on the rack. I strongly recommend that you consider how you will be accessing the rear of your patch bay in the future. If you have access to the rear of the rack, then you can pack things much more closely. In my case, because I don't have rear access, I'm leaving a couple of spaces between each of my patch bays. Therefore, in the future, I will be able to access it easily from the front. At this point, you're basically done. Just put your plugs into the back, replace any panels on the rack, put the plugs in the front, and you're ready to go. So this is my final opinion of the patch bay. First of all, it is very solidly built. This is in contrast to some of the earlier versions of this. It is really economical. It's highly flexible. It supports a broad number of grounding topologies. It supports balanced or unbalanced connections, and it allows you to configure it to a variety of different normalization schemes. So it is very flexible. And finally, it's very aesthetically pleasing. It has clean lines and just is actually quite nice. However, this patch bay is not without its weak points. To begin with, I find the default normalization is somewhat awkward. And finally, changing the normalization can really be quite an involved process.